Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me at the market site in Times Square, New York City, we have Pierce Crosby. He's the GM of Americas over at TradingView. We're going to take a look at charting with TradingView with some of the most popular topics in the marketplace right now. Of course, we have China, Nasdaq 100, healthcare, and rounding it off with a 10-year Treasury note with those yields below 0.9%. Pierce, it's great to have you with us. I use TradingView, and I'm really enjoying all the different techniques that you can use within the charts. So let's take a run through what we're looking at on the platform. We're going to start with China versus NDX, what you're looking at fundamentally and what the charts are telling you.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge divergence that we don't see very frequently. Usually the two run in a similar band, and that's because China telecom and e-commerce is something that kind of closely follows the US. You can see here, based on the NDX divergence, is that China really hasn't priced in what we think coronavirus could be doing to the local market. And this is kind of a trade where we see either a convergence back to the norm or China potentially falling quite farther. And so the lack of China really pricing this in kind of suggests to me that there's something going on with local demand, or it's just not really being, bought, if you will, by the larger market story.
Yeah, which is really interesting because the Nasdaq 100 obviously heavily weighted to tech, and a lot of those companies have that exposure to China.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you were able to identify that, and it could be a good trade depending on what you're looking.
A good trade depending on which side you take.
Right,
I'd say,
right.
Naturally speaking, if this is what we think for the Nasdaq, which usually leads price, following that, we could see its large divergence or downward momentum maybe for the next couple of days across China. And if that's the case, maybe expect softness in the region versus the NDX, or if the NDX is maybe undervalued, a bounce back to the norm. But you could definitely see that the gap should slightly push back to even across the board here. This is something that was pulled up from one of our China experts on TradingView.
All right, let's take a look at our next chart here, healthcare. There is a lot going on in this chart. You'll explain to us what the different technicals that we're looking at here. Healthcare certainly in play this week with Joe Biden emerging as the front runner, appears to be more market friendly, especially the healthcare sector versus Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, and this is kind of a story of Bernie Sanders not being actually the front runner for the presidential election here in the U.S. What we look at both is the volume studies as well as kind of the technical levels. United Healthcare is obviously a great indicator for overall performance of the sector, and across TradingView, people are talking about it specifically because of previous administrations actually being more bullish or more positive for the space versus maybe newcomer candidates or potential outlier candidates being more of a volatile period comparatively. So what you see is a natural uptrend, which is the general market over time, and then in recent days, it seems that Joe Biden will be the presidential nomination, and we see kind of a spike higher as a result of that, right? And you're looking at very specific ranges on the volume side. We haven't seen the same volume hitting below this kind of 275, 280 point. But if you do see a larger kind of volume study or volume kind of gap up here, that's kind of, I guess, a confidence that this is going to be the go-to election standard going forward. But the whole group, not just United Healthcare, if you look at healthcare across the board in the U.S., funny enough, Joe Biden is the presidential nominee of record for the entire space. We see a very similar actual positioning with financials, which could tell you a lot more just about.
Oh, that's interesting because they're the worst performing sector.
Worst performing sector over time, yeah. And so if you see a similar kind of spike up with future news, I would again look for those very large bulking volume around the kind of bottom. But this is a specific study that we look at as the volume actually traded at that point in time. The news itself is a big point of interest, but follow-on is kind of really what you want to see in order to make sure that that's really being priced in and not just rumors, if you will.
All right, let's wrap it up with the 10-year Treasury note because this has been probably the biggest story that we're seeing all week as those yields continue to decline. We're certainly seeing that reflected in the stock market today, for sure.
I mean, lowest levels of all time on the yields for the 10-year. On TradingView, we have a bunch of macro traders who are watching this on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, and obviously as larger issues come up like the coronavirus, et cetera, people are expecting to see a spike or potentially a reversal of this. But what we see is a continual decline, and it really kind of brings us to a question of, is there a bottom for the 10-year? And from what I see today, we just see continual downward momentum that doesn't really see any bottom in sight. And so if we break through, you know, $1, I mean, 1% on the yield, the next point down will be something in the 90 cents range. And, you know, even if we're thinking back to, you know, the early 90s, I mean, 14, 15%, it's a huge downward move. It's amazing to think that, you know, by the end of this year, if not early next year, we'll be trading at maybe eighth of a percent, which is.
Oh, we touched that today. We got an eighth handle today, if you will.
Right, exactly. So actually trading for the 10-year along those lines, and 30 years following very closely. So if you see divergences there may be something at play. But the fact that both are moving down very quickly up into the end of the year. Again, election is a big issue, but really today the headline being the Corona momentum, and I guess it's really being priced in from the bonds point of view.
Right.
So,
all right. Well, I'm going to watch an NDX China trade. That was certainly interesting. Thank you so much for joining us at MarketSite, and thank you for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.